I'm David Tibaldi, the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, and on behalf of the Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to our 30th Anniversary Symposium, U.S. Presidents in Perspective, the Shifting Fortunes of Presidential Reputations. As you may be aware, there has been an efflorescence of presidential scholarship in recent years, and we're very fortunate to have with us today some of the country's most respected historians, biographers, and students of the presidency. There's information about the Humanities Foundation at the registration table outside. I'd encourage you to take home a copy of our biannual publication, Mass Humanities, if you're not already on our mailing list. There are also some little cards you can fill out with your mailing address. I think there's a box out there to drop them in if you'd like to be put on our mailing list so that you could learn about other wonderful programs like the one you're about to participate in today. C-SPAN is here, as you see. I apologize for the lights and hope that it's not too much of a problem for you. Feel free to move your seat if you find that to be stressful in any way. If you've always wanted to be on national television, today may be your chance. There have been a couple of changes in the program, as you may already know. Douglas Brinkley has been replaced on panel 1 by Jack Beatty. That's the President and the Press, our first panel. And E.J. Dionne will be replaced by David Halberstam as moderator of panel 3, the President and His Enemies. Not a bad bench, huh? A word about the format of today's program. This is a public symposium. It's not an academic conference. There aren't going to be any speeches or papers read. We're striving for a conversational tone. Each panel will be 1 hour in length. After a brief opening statement by the moderator, the panel will immediately engage in a conversation focused, we hope, more or less, on the topic they've been assigned. After about 35 or 40 minutes, we'll open to questions from the floor, questions and comments. If you wish to make a statement or ask a question, it's very, very important that you go to one of the standing mics. You'll see there's one in the front of each aisle. If you just stand at the mic and wait to be recognized, we can maintain some order and dignity. Feel free to state your name and where you're from if you like. It's very important to be brief and succinct in your comments and questions so that as many people as possible have a chance to speak, say what's on their mind, or ask a question. Because of the necessities of live television broadcast, we're going to be rather ruthless about staying on schedule. So please don't be offended in any way if you get cut off. We're going to end on time. We're going to start the second panel on time. We're going to end the symposium on time. There will be a 15-minute break in between where you can go outside and have some refreshments, grab some fresh air. Books by all of our authors are going to be on sale. They're setting up right now in the Kresge room. If you go out the auditorium doors, turn to the right, walk by the windows, it'll take you right there. And all of our authors have agreed to stick around after the symposium is over from 4:30 till about 5:15 and sign books if you would like. The only exception is David Gergen, who I'm sorry to say must leave immediately after his panel session. Okay? It is now my pleasure to introduce to you the president of Boston College, who will make some welcoming remarks. Reverend William P. Leahy, S.J., was named president of Boston College in 1996, and under his leadership, the university has seen remarkable increases in undergraduate applications, average freshman SAT scores, funding for faculty research, and annual giving. He's doing a terrific job. Boston College is today among the top 40 universities in the country. And the sports program isn't bad either. As some of you may know, Father Leahy's response to the crisis facing the Catholic Church, an educational project called the Church in the 21st Century Initiative, has elicited admiration and hope across the entire country. Raised on a farm in Iowa, Father Leahy holds a doctorate in history from Stanford University. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Father Bill Leahy.
I have the honor of welcoming you to campus this afternoon on behalf of all of us in the Boston College community. I am particularly pleased that our partner in today's symposium is the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, which seeks to provide forums for citizens to engage in thoughtful public discourse about matters of individual choice and collective responsibility. Helping individuals develop their personal gifts and encouraging them to use those talents in service of the wider community has been part of the mission of Boston College since our founding in 1863. Such goals reflect our long-standing commitment to liberal arts education and to our deep Jesuit and Catholic roots. St. Ignatius Loyola, who founded the Jesuit order in 1540, wanted Jesuit schools to prepare graduates who would be a leaven for good wherever they lived and worked. That vision animates Boston College today. We want our students, faculty, staff, alumni to bring light to the world in their studies, their teaching, their research, and their service. And I can say, as an educator whose academic discipline is American history, that I am particularly pleased by the focus of this afternoon's symposium. We know how critical it is for us as individuals and for our nation to have perspective and to exercise sound judgment. I look forward to the comments from our panelists about decisions and perceptions of American presidents, and I am delighted that Boston College can serve as co-host of this exploration of leadership and its consequences. I'm also pleased that we can have our C-SPAN audience with us. So I thank you for being part of this symposium. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm John Dacey. I'm board president of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities. Welcome to our program today. Today's symposium is just one of a number of programs and events being held across the Commonwealth to celebrate our 30th anniversary. When we first started planning the symposium, we were looking for an appropriate venue. With Boston College, not only did we find a wonderful venue, but we got the benefits of a great university as our host and as our partner. Many thanks to Father Leahy and the staff of Boston College for their work and help in making today such a success. The staff of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, our 30th anniversary committee, and our board of directors also worked very hard to bring about this symposium. I'm very grateful for their efforts and ask you to please join me in extending them a warm thank you for all of those who worked on today's program. The Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities is the Massachusetts affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. The animating vision of the Massachusetts Foundation derives from Thomas Jefferson, personal favorite president of mine. He wrote, and I quote, "I know of no safe repository of the ultimate powers of government but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their power with a wholesome discretion, the cure is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion." By sponsoring projects that bring the perspectives of history, literature, and philosophy to bear on the issues of concern to the people of Massachusetts, the Foundation advances this Jeffersonian ideal of an informed and engaged citizenry. And of course, today's symposium is in keeping with that mission. We're delighted to see so many of you here, delighted to welcome the C-SPAN audience for what will be a provocative series of conversations with many of our country's most distinguished presidential historians, biographers, and commentators. Now, why the theme, Shifting Fortunes of Presidential Reputations? At the end of every presidential term, attention is focused on the president's place in history, a topic as much on the mind of the Oval Office's occupant as on the minds of historians and commentators, and often much more of a focus during a second term. In truth, however, American presidents don't occupy any one place in history. They occupy many places, and their placements shift and their reputations change with the passage of time. To look at the changing fortunes of presidential reputations is in one sense to look at the record itself, at what we now know about particular presidencies that was not available earlier. This examination also offers insight into how American society has changed, how our own evolving concerns and values, of course being a big word currently, how today's concerns and values shape our perceptions of the past. And speaking of perceptions, Harry Truman, who was of course known as Give 'em Hell Harry, he said, "I never did give them hell. I just told the truth, and they thought it was hell." So I now invite you to sit back and enjoy an afternoon of lively conversation that I believe will, as Jefferson said, inform your discretion.
Good afternoon. My name is David Harris. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, and it's an honor to be here with you today to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Foundation. I'd like to echo John's comments and thanks to my fellow board members, to the staff of the Mass Foundation, and to the 30th Anniversary Committee, as well as recognize John's leadership of the board. We're here today to celebrate an important anniversary, and I think we have an appropriately impressive set of panel discussions today. I'd also like to emphasize, however, that the Foundation works tirelessly and constantly to bring the humanities to life in all of our communities throughout the Commonwealth, month to month, year to year. And it's really the culmination of 30 years of doing so that we celebrate today. I'd now like to introduce the panel we have, and again, it's an honor for me to do so. They're all people with whom we're quite familiar, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about them. First, we have Jack Beatty, senior editor of the Atlantic Monthly and author of The Rascal King, the best-selling biography of our James Michael Curley. Secondly, the moderator of this first panel will be Ellen Hume, a former White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, newspaper reporter for 19 years, executive director of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University. She has also directed PBS's Democracy Project and is the founding director of the Center on Media and Society at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Our third participant this morning, Kathleen Dalton, is an associate fellow at the Charles Warren Center at Harvard University, an instructor at the Phillips Academy, and the author of Theodore Roosevelt, A Strenuous Life, which the New York Review of Books has called by far the best one-volume biography of Teddy Roosevelt. And finally, we're joined by Tom Wicker, as we know, a distinguished journalist and writer and the author of 10 novels and 9 works of nonfiction, including One of Us, Richard Nixon and the American Dream, JFK and LBJ, and Kennedy Without Tears. He's also written short biographies of Dwight D. Eisenhower and George H.W. Bush. I invite you to join me in welcoming this distinguished panel.
I'm tempted to invite Father Leahy to help establish an inquiry into the relationship between the presidency and the press. You did very well with your last one, so let's encourage you to stay engaged. It's delightful to be here, and thank you all for coming. I hope that you will engage with us, so please be encouraged. Get your questions and comments ready. And if you go on for too long, I'll cut you off. So anyway, let me start by just sort of couching the conversation. This panel is really about the press and the presidency and how that affects the legacy of these presidents. It's been famously suggested that journalists write the first draft of history. And so it follows then that their role in shaping the legacy of a presidency is an important one. And I think while we can be fairly certain about who the president is from day to day, although some like Al Haig may confuse it a bit at times, the identification of the journalist is not so easy. Journalists have appeared as pamphleteers, documentarians, White House correspondents, talk show pundits, and now bloggers on the internet. The press has, in the modern era, been viewed as the gatekeeper of what commands our attention, which has been a challenge for presidents. But that has been shifting in this internet cable TV era because there are no longer any gates for information, unless you, of course, count Bill Gates. There are several other factors worth noting as we begin our discussion. First, no matter how important the journalist's watchdog role may be to our democracy, journalists today have fewer and fewer incentives to perform that job. For all that has been said about journalistic biases, and I teach about this in my course on news media and political power at UMass Boston, there seems little understanding by the public about the real biases that actually influence their coverage of the president or a presidential campaign. I hope we'll get into that a bit today. I believe that now the most crippling media bias is the popularity bias. Journalists must become celebrities in their own right in order to survive in this talk show culture, with hundreds, if not thousands, of competing voices of authority. If a journalist has to be popular, then she's unlikely to ask the tough questions, challenge popular lies, or try to focus our attention on the bad news in Sudan or Iraq. The overt, entertaining partisan bias, which so colored our newspapers in the early days of the Republic, was quite different from what we have today, I think, but that old model seems to be returning. Complaints about the liberal bias in the media, which really took hold in the wake of the civil rights movement, Watergate, and Vietnam, have become ascendant thanks in part to press arrogance and also to an aggressive campaign from the right, including Pat Buchanan and Roger Ailes, a brilliant political operative who now is the head of Fox Cable News. At the same time, the charge of commercial bias has been gathering steam, thanks in part to media observers from the left, including Noam Chomsky. Both charges of some sort of political partisanship or of commercialism hopelessly skewing the news were initially, I think, overblown and unfair, but they are coming true now. These critics, capitalizing on high-profile scandals and failures by the news media, together with the public's relative inattention to what really goes on in journalism, I think have helped to create the declining power of journalism in influencing governance. I believe the ideal of dispassionate fact-gathering by journalists, which certainly animated my career, that of Tom Wicker, Jack Beatty, and others, was always impossible to fulfill, but worthy nonetheless as a professional attempt. But there are few initiatives in this balkanized media landscape and faith-based political culture for fact-based news to continue under the present business models for journalism. So the professional journalists have in this current era lost their clout of the post-Watergate period, which derived largely from their watchdog role, the rise of television, and the decline of political parties. The power has shifted back to the president and his allies. So what are the implications of this as President Bush begins his new term? In his first term, President Bush had fewer press conferences by far than his recent predecessors in both parties. The New York Times, which is arguably the paper of record the professional journalists still look to as the gold standard, despite some of its problems in recent days, was denied interviews with the president and was barred from the vice president's plane. A Washington Post reporter was similarly blackballed when he wrote that the president was not telling the truth about something. So journalists who serve as cheerleaders for the government and fail to raise serious questions to hold the government accountable are gaining in popularity and influence. At the same time, in the name of security concerns, a curtain of secrecy has fallen over the government. John Dean, who's here at this conference, writes in his book, Worse Than Watergate, that, quote, their secrecy is extreme, not merely unjustified and excessive, but obsessive, unquote. As Renee Loth wrote in the Boston Globe op-ed recently, quote, when it comes to closed government, the Bush administration makes the Nixon White House look like the public library, unquote. A special prosecutor, Patrick Fitzgerald, seems intent on imprisoning Judith Miller of the New York Times for refusing to tell her confidential sources, even though she wrote no stories about the case that they are investigating. And as Nick Kristof wrote in the New York Times on November 10, quote, "We journalists are in this mess partly because we're widely seen as arrogant and biased, and we need to wrestle seriously with those issues. But when reporters face jail time for doing their jobs, the ultimate victim is the free flow of information, the circulatory system of any democracy," unquote. President Bush must feel enormously pleased that the journalism coming out of Iraq and the fact-checking about John Kerry's Vietnam service, as well as other fact-based journalism that directly challenged his version of reality during the campaign, did not, in the end, matter. I will now turn to our panel to give us some historical perspective on all of this, and perhaps to tell us that the watchdog press was never a good idea, or that things used to be worse. So, number one, I would like to start with our genuine historian, our professional trained historian, Kathleen, to ask you, have the press and the president always had such a contentious relationship?
Well, I feel as though we're doing historical therapy here today. But let me just say that some of the phenomena that you're talking about are not entirely new, and that a very partisan press existed in the first part of American history, that one party would have a newspaper and another party would have a newspaper, and that they would produce news that was Republican or, well, it would be Whig or Democrat, and that's a long-standing tradition. So for those of you in the audience who are very, very upset about Fox News or other news outlets, it's not new. It's bigger, and it's 5 media companies owning our public airwaves, and so that's there's an oligopoly going on, but it's not new. And people survived in the 19th century and got a lot of news from their own political party, from their neighbors, from other sources. And the watchdog press is really a creature of more recent times. The big turning point, of course, I would see this because it's Theodore Roosevelt, but the White House was not covered very systematically before the late 1890s. And so it's that point when they started to send reporters to watch who Grover Cleveland was visiting and who went to the White House, that the public really has the press as much more of an advocate. But even then, the New York Times was a partisan Democratic newspaper. It was not the great newspaper it is today. So things have changed over time. And Theodore Roosevelt was the person who created the press room in the White House. He saw a bunch of reporters standing outside the White House freezing, and he said, well, come on in. And he was the person who tried very hard to make the presidency much more responsive to the press, and he tried to make friends with the press. Now, that's not to say that he didn't punish them if they wrote nasty stories about his misbehaving children, chasing turkeys and massacring animals, or misbehaving, riding roller skates through the East Room and ruining the floor, those kinds of things. He would prohibit a reporter from, again, coming to the White House. So again, what we're seeing today is not entirely new. The Republic survived, and it's something that's very important to remember, that we've been through polarized times before. And even though it's a little bit different today, I think we've survived it. TR did like the give and take of kind of mixing it up with reporters, but he had favorites. And so he'd invite people in to be given exclusive interviews when he was being shaved, and would go on big hikes with them and make them his buddies as long as they wrote the story he liked. FDR, who was a master of politics, was very concerned about shifting American public opinion to be ready to fight Hitler, because we remember that America was not really ready and was very inclined towards not fighting after World War I. He got Dorothy Thompson to come to the White House and write interventionist stories and to go on the radio. He encouraged her to tell the truth about Hitler and Mussolini. And so he worked with the press and gave over 900 press conferences. So there are times when the president is not in an adversarial relationship, but there have been moments when presidents have behaved maybe not exactly like our current president, but there have been tendencies towards punishing your critics. and trying to manipulate the news. That's a long-standing tendency in American life.
Very good. Thank you. Tom, you've covered a number of presidents, as I recall, and I wonder how you feel about that adversarial relationship. Has it been a positive factor or a negative factor, and how do you see it going forward now?
Well, I think it's very definitely the adversarial relationship, if it existed, and when it rarely does, I think it's definitely an asset for the American public. But I bear in mind here that sometime toward the end of the Nixon administration, Henry Kissinger, who was a courtier if there ever was one, he said, well, Mr. President, says, history will treat you very, very well. And Nixon said to him, Henry, that depends on who writes the history. And I think it's very true, and probably even truer about the press than about the historians that Mr. Nixon had in mind. And I think, just as has been said here, the whole idea that some presidents get along well with the press and some don't, that the adversarial relationship is at times really quite sharp, and at other times it hardly even exists. I think that's more of a matter of cyclical affairs than of necessarily sloth or eagerness on the part of the press. I was reminded, as you were saying, about President Roosevelt actually suborning articles that advocated intervention in the war. I don't see that there's very much difference between that and President Bush, if he did, suborning articles for the invasion of Iraq. I mean, if the president can get the press to write what he or perhaps sometime in the future she wants, then the press is certainly not doing its job. I recall once, this is a very rare occasion, but before a news conference, President Kennedy was about to have a news conference. He had them every week, interestingly enough, except when something bad happened, then he skipped 2 or 3 weeks. But generally speaking, he had them every week, and before one of these news conferences, Pierre Salinger, who died recently, I'm very sorry to say, Pierre took me aside and he said, if you'll ask a certain question, I can't remember what it was now, you'll get a good answer. I said, Pierre, I don't ask planted questions. Okay, he said, all right, fine. Well, news conference came, and some other guy stood up in the audience and asked that question. And he did get a good answer, and we all got a story out of it. So my point is that this kind of thing is not new, or even presidents not having news conferences is not new. This is my last anecdote here for the moment. But I was once in a morning news conference at the White House. Press secretary, in that case it was George Reedy, used to have them around his desk in a little office off the press lobby. And I complained quite loudly and bitterly that President Johnson was not having the news conferences that he had promised. Okay, so George, as he usually did, made some non-committal remark, and we got through that and went back out to the press lobby, and in about 2 minutes, Bill Moyers, who was in on the White House staff, came out to me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, the president wants to see you. So he had obviously been eavesdropping on the news conference in there. So I hastened in, in those days, hastened in to see the president, and all the way in I kept trying to think of a good question, because with LBJ you better have one good question. It was the only one you were going to get in. And indeed, I didn't even have a good question before Johnson started saying, well, we're going to have more news conferences and all that sort of thing. Whereupon a 20-minute monologue ensued in which I didn't get any questions. And he pulled press clippings out of his pocket and so forth. So the point I'm making, or trying to make here, is that the relationship between the press and the president goes up and down. It goes up and down with presidents, with the nature of the press. We had some people in the White House press when I was covering President Kennedy who had covered President Roosevelt, certainly Harry Truman. So these were older fellows, and they had a different perspective in many ways. So these things go up and down, and I don't think, from what I can read, the relationship between the current incumbent and the press is not very good. From what I can read, I don't know anything about it not being there, but it seems to be not very good. But I think that's cyclical. And it may be, in this case, it may be George Bush's fault. May not be, I don't know. But I think the next president, whoever he or she might be in 3 or 4 years, is probably going to go out of his or her way in order to get along with the press, just to be in contrast with the last guy.
Or maybe to get along with the bloggers.
Maybe. That would be too bad.
Thank you, Tom. Some people in the audience, I hope you're getting hot under the collar, you conservatives. Are you getting ready? We do want to hear from you. But first I want to turn to Jack for your perspective on this so-called adversarial relationship and whether it's important or not.
Well, you know, what strikes me is the United States is now in an unnecessary war, and that's a tragedy worse compounded when you think about that. Any war is tragic, but when it's unnecessary, and we know it's unnecessary because what we found out, and we didn't find it out ahead of time about the weapons of mass destruction, about all the allegations, partly because the press did not perform its job. It is a sign of the times that our two papers of record, the Washington Post and the New York Times, should have had to run front page mea culpas about their coverage of the lead-in to the Iraq War, about their failure to rebut and to find alternative sources of information to set in a parenthesis of skepticism the claims the administration was making. In the case of the Times, I'm afraid to say, it was even worse, because the Times a reporter had the same source about Iraqi weapons that was misleading the Pentagon, an ally of Chalabi. So in other words, our paper of record was tainted by the same source as the Pentagon was, and was passing this on as news. Now this was a failure of our central institutions. I can't remember anything like it. It's as if, Tom had a colleague, James Reston, who wrote a book called The Artillery of the Press. Well, it's as if the artillery of the press were turned around and fired at us, not at power. And I think that was, so I think this is a bad time for that relationship. Now, the papers apologized. Of course, the media that broadcast something else. But, and then one thought, well, they're going to be challenging. And sure enough, there are challenging stories. But we've just come through a campaign where the Bush campaign essentially used tactics very similar to what it used about the Iraq War, namely passing propaganda off as information. I defy any fair-minded person here to look at factcheck.org, which is run by the Annenberg Center. It tallies up all the distortions by both candidates. John Kerry made his share, but nothing to compare to the systematic falsehoods and mendacity that came out of the mouths of George Bush and Dick Cheney. And how did the press report that? Mr. Cheney today said that John Kerry voted against 18 weapon systems when he was in the Senate. Does it say that Dick Cheney, as Secretary of Defense, wanted to cancel? No. There was no challenging of the claims. They were just passed on, or they went to some neutral party who says, "Is it really true that?" In other words, the press has two roles: to play a role as the mirror and a lamp. And increasingly, it's played the role of the mirror. Here's what the White House says. Here's what the candidate says, not the lamp. Here's the real truth. Here are these and it's part of the tradition of journalism, the tradition of objectivity, I think, that has got us into this fix. Because objectivity is, well, you say this and you say that. But if one side is essentially telling lies and the other side is, trying to, roughly represent things, it's not a fair debate. And the press, rather than vetting the credentials or the truth claims, is essentially just representing the side of propaganda. So we are in a bad, bad time when our major institutions have failed us And people now are dying because of it, young men and women in Iraq. Oh. And so I think it's a terrible time. And let's have some adversary relationship between these institutions to save us from more of this folly.
Jack, why don't you tell us what you really think? We definitely hope to hear some conservative voices from the audience to balance this panel. Thank you. I would like to leave that part of the discussion for a moment and let you guys pick it up when you start engaging us and turn to another topic that I think you'll find very juicy, which is that when Teddy White started to cover presidential elections, he's famously known for steering us away from the official pronouncements and actions of the candidates and the presidents toward the more internal issues of what is the character of this person and who are his friends and what is he eating for breakfast and what's it really like spontaneously and really what's the feel and the smell. And this fed right into the television era in which we have the sense that we're actually experiencing the president. We actually know him. He's in our house. As we eat dinner, we can listen to him and watch him. So this more intimate relationship of the journalist and the president, and of the public with the president, has led us to, I think, sometimes mix up the public and the private life and the public and the private agenda. And I want to turn again to our historian, because you mentioned that in Teddy Roosevelt's day, the press was out there covering the children. But as you observe subsequently, do you feel that this balance between what we want to know about the public life and the private life has gotten skewed? Or is it appropriate for us to constantly try to figure out the sex lives of our candidates and the private lives of our presidents, perhaps using up the news hole that might have been used instead on Bosnia or school lunch programs?
Well, it's true that the character issue, which is should we choose a president based on who we have as a gut sense of who this person is rather than the official issues. I have mixed feelings about that because as I was watching the debates this year, I thought they were pretty educational ways to get at who these people are, but they also were airing of the issues. They didn't have an ultimate deciding factor. They didn't make us change our vote ultimately, but I think the more voters get to know about the person as a person, it's good. I think generally that it's better for voters to know more about the people and to know more about the issues. Obviously, we've just been through a time when Clinton's sex life became a major national issue, and a lot of people said it doesn't matter. What he does in his private life doesn't matter, or it doesn't matter as much as those advocates of impeachment wanted to. And he did commit an illegal act, and he admitted that. Well, I think that was a sidetrack. They really used his personal life as a way to get him politically. And I think probably that's what the danger is in emphasizing character. I'm all in favor of looking at character and looking at the whole person. That's what I do as a biographer. So I believe in that. I think in the case of Clinton's impeachment crisis, it was used as a way to get at him when they couldn't get at him politically.
Interesting. And my theory about that, too, is that we're so used in our talk shows to seeing these intimate details that are more depraved by far,
right,
that I think that's one of the reasons the public didn't rise up and say, yes, throw the man out.
And other countries laugh at us. This is, when you travel to other countries, they say, well, it's because you have a Puritan history, and that no serious country like France or England would do this, that we don't ask those questions, and there's something wrong with Americans that you ask these questions.
And yet, I think those who believe the impeachment was important would say there was a question of integrity that is important. So I think these character issues are double-sided.
Right.
And I'd like to hear what, Tom, you've covered some presidents whose peccadillos may not have been observed as fully, or am I wrong about that?
No, that's you're asking about private lives here. Robert Kennedy used to say on Meet the Press, before I answer your question, I'd like to say this, and then he'd go ahead and say something totally irrelevant. So before I answer your question, I hate to be the skunk at the garden party here, and I certainly hate to take issue with my esteemed friend Jack. And I don't take issue on the deficiency of the press in the run-up to the war in Iraq. In fact, I think the lament of both the Washington Post and the New York Times was, in effect, that their reporters didn't put enough scrutiny on their sources. They didn't examine enough what they were saying. I agree with that in every word. To the extent that I take issue, is that I don't think there's anything new about that. When I first started covering the White House in 1961, and I'm not trying to say that I had anything to do with it, but the Eisenhower years were still really in effect, and there was very little television. President Kennedy was the first president to open his news conferences to live TV. We still had, instead of TV cameramen in the press lobby, we had the newsreel cameramen. They call themselves the reels, and a more profane bunch you've never encountered. But my point being that the New York Times did not issue an apologia, as it should have, for the fact that we didn't know anything about President Kennedy's sex life. The New York Times did not issue an apologia, as it should have, because we did not report anything of any importance about President Kennedy's health, as we should have. The New York Times and the Washington Post didn't either. The New York Times did not issue any kind of an apology because in 1944 he did not cover at all one of the great scandals in American history, that President Roosevelt was too sick to run and knew he was too sick to run and shouldn't have run. So I'm saying that the press not doing what it ought to do in terms of being the so-called watchdog is nothing new. And this changes. It changed, for example, after Watergate. As I'm sure John Dean remembers, it changed after Watergate. It changed after Vietnam. It certainly changed after we began to see that the propaganda that the press had helped spread about Iraq was not true, or not fully true, and so forth. But we didn't have any kind of revelation like that until maybe a year later about President Kennedy's sex life, and later on about his health. I was White House correspondent at that time. I should have issued an apologia because I didn't know anything about that. And why didn't I know anything about it? Because I didn't work hard enough, and the press didn't work hard enough. And I think this is the problem more often than not, that the press, as was certainly true in the Eisenhower years and in the early Kennedy years, it tends to be a handout press. It always has tended to be a handout press. And then something happens like Watergate, or the war in Vietnam, or the war in Iraq, and everybody says, oh, gee, I'm sorry. I wish I had done my job. But they didn't do their job, and half the time, at least half the time, and probably more, they don't do their job.
But Tom, didn't you also think it wasn't your job to cover the private life of the president?
No. In retrospect, I think I was seriously deficient. I think the private life of the president is open sesame. If Bill Clinton goes on television and tells us he wears boxer shorts, what's off limits? What's off limits? I mean, these guys, I don't care whether you're governor or mayor, you would know this from Mayor Curtis. I don't care whether you're a governor or mayor or what. You go on TV, if there is TV, or the radio, or in public, you exploit your little dog, my little dog Fowler. You exploit your wife, you exploit your children, you exploit your underwear, your saxophone. And then try to tell us avoid the private life. Bill Clinton issues a statement, he hopes the press will not cover when Chelsea arrives at the campus at Stanford. And they arrive in a 30-car motorcade. Now,
thank you, Tom. Jack, what is your perspective on this public-private issue?
Well, I certainly agree with what Tom said. But, what bothers me is the way, maybe it's, I don't know that it's the public, but the way the media has skewed the character issue. It's about sex. And, I'm not a theologian, but my mother, who qualifies as an uncanonized saint, used to say that sins of the flesh they're serious, but they're pretty way low down on the totem pole simply because of their ubiquity, and that they're but that the real sins are cruelty and lying and using power.
How about drunk driving, Jack?
Or executing 135 in the state of Texas.
According to the law.
According to the law. But, as the Atlantic Monthly pointed out, this is speaking of Governor Bush, his then counsel, Mr. Gonzalez, pretty much went through these petitions for clemency, just in a pro forma. He said, I cut it down to 20 minutes, so I didn't have to take the governor's time. It was, up or down. Well, it was always down. Now that is a character issue. It seems to me that nobody nobody's life was given back to them by the governor. So I just don't like the way this has been narrowed down to sexual matters, which are really it's how you use power. Seems to me that's the moral question for leaders.
Very good. How you use power. I want you to start lining up. You have power here, you in the audience. But as you start lining up, I wanted to pose to our historian, and actually the whole panel, very quickly, to give us an example of how either the press or the president got an upper hand, an anecdote on how they got the upper hand over the other, the one over the other. Was there a time when one of the Roosevelts managed to manipulate the press or get the upper hand?
Well, I was actually thinking about remember the Gulf War, not letting journalists in and giving them false.
Into the battlefield,
and then giving them false information about the effectiveness of those missile defense systems. The Pentagon lied with the first President Bush's permission to the press about the effectiveness of the missile defense systems.
Do we know that they lied, or were they misled themselves at the time?
I think they lied. I think it's really, that was a case where I understand Tom's feeling about we should have done better, but the press is in an unequal situation when all the information is controlled by the Pentagon. And what could any journalist do if they're controlling all the information about how effective these missiles are? So the Gulf War was portrayed as a great patriotic success, and that was when CNN was just starting to get popular. And it was the news is just disgustingly one-sided and patriotic. And the effect of Fox News is really to intimidate the mainstream media into being flag-waving. It was very upsetting to me this year to see on Fox News people called traitors and treasonous, including reporters who dared to criticize the war. That seems profoundly un-American to me. So let me just say that in wartime, historically, we know presidents have the upper hand in the relationship with the press. We see that with Woodrow Wilson. We've seen that with FDR, although he didn't abuse it as much. But it's a very unequal relationship. And I don't think the press should blame themselves so much.
Did you want to do a quick anecdote, or just go to the audience here?
No, I just would like to say that I agree with what you said, except that I think the president has the upper hand all the time, unless he chooses not to exercise it, because the president occupies a particular position in our society. I suppose not unlike the King or Queen of England. And I think that I have had the experience, let's say at the height of President Kennedy's popularity, I used to have a seat down in the front row. I'd stand up and ask a question, perhaps a mildly hostile question. Believe me, it would have been mildly. And I would get a sharp answer from him. And in the next few days, I would get a lot of mail. How dare you ask our president a question like that?
Yeah.
I'm telling you, if you want to stand up to the president, if you want to take issue with the president, if you want to say that's not true, or if you want to say, it's not only untrue, it's a lie, and particularly if you want to say a lie, you better be prepared for it. You're going to get it from the public. And those of us who were for John Kerry, we got it for the public last week, didn't we? I mean, you do that because the President of the United States occupies a particular kind of position. And unless he more or less abdicates it, as the current incumbent's father did in 1992, then he has got the upper hand over the press at all times. And remember, the press is not just Bob Novak or me. It's 200, 300, 400 people. And you can have the experience of standing up against the president or the governor or whatever it may be, and nobody else does. And all of a sudden you're out there alone. That's fine, isn't it? To be on top of the mountain all alone, that's great, until your editor calls you in and says, why didn't we have that story? And they do. Editors don't like to stand alone, if you'll excuse me saying that. I'm talking about newspaper editors.
Okay, Tom. Jack, did you have one quick anecdote?
No, I just wondered, Tom, what about the Bay of Pigs? There was a case where the president used your paper and really the loser was the public, was the United States of America.
By suppressing the story?
Well, he didn't really suppress it. I guess he did. That's the right word. The Turner Catlett tells this story, who was then the managing editor of the Times, tells this story in his memoir that the original Bay of Pigs story, when it came in, the Bullpen, which is a peculiar New York Times organization that plans the front page, had it slotted to go down in column 8 with a 3-column headline. Now, that would have wake people up. After protests from the White House and James Reston and people like that, they moved the story over to column 2, which is a very fast come down, and took off the 3-column headline and put on a 1-column headline. Now, that is really climbing down on the news, on the New York Times, and so I suppose that's suppression, but it was internal suppression. They did it on purpose, and Turner Catlett said in his memoir, fine man, I love Turner, but he said in his memoir, I did it because I thought a lot of Americans were going to get killed, and I didn't want the New York Times to be blamed.
Wow. All right, we have a very active audience. I'm so glad to see you here, and we have about, I'd say, 10 to 15 minutes. So if you could say who you are and address your question or your comment to one panelist only, then we can get through all of you. I want to hear from all of you. Let's start with you, and please say who you are.
I'm Eva Mosley from the People's Republic of Cambridge.
And this lesson's your last right?
I'm not sure who to address this to, maybe Tom Wicker. I have been concerned with the unequal treatment of the press, by the press, of various presidents, and specifically the difference between the way the press approached Ronald Reagan for virtually all of his 8 years and the current president versus the way they approached Bill Clinton, where Bill Clinton, it seemed, could do no right and the others could do no wrong. They did not. There was endless talk about Bill Clinton's sex life, which has very little to do with what he does as president. There was no talk virtually of George Bush, George W., being the first president with a criminal record, that he had, I don't care about his drug use, except that he put people in jail in Texas for doing what he had done and gotten away with. And it's that okay,
that's a good
get
question.
the idea.
Tom, what do you say, Tom?
I'll defend to the death her right to say all that. I think that you've borne out what I say, that press treatment tends to be unequal and goes on. I think it was true, for example, that press treated President Kennedy very well, fundamentally because we thought he liked us. Therefore, we liked him. We probably treated President Nixon pretty badly because we knew he didn't like us. And therefore, we didn't like him.
Another factor was I actually tried to cover President Reagan honorably and honestly and openly and without bias. And what happened is if I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, it was fact-based about policy. And the president went on television and said, I like senior citizens, I'm one myself. Even as he cut the budget for senior programs, the public engaged with him and not with me. He went right over our heads. I think that's an important factor to remember about a president of significant charm, and certainly President Reagan was one of those.
That's
yes,
right.
please.
To follow up on that, so that,
say who you are, please.
Reg McKean. Both Ellen and Jack particularly have raised the most important issue we're dealing with today. How does the press hold the president accountable? And I agree with Jack that the press in this last campaign was most unsuccessful in making the public aware of how dishonest Bush was. But I'm sure to Jack and myself, reading the Globe and Times each day and factcheck.org, I mean, the media did tell the public about these lies. You did have to do a little work and search for it and read the whole paper, not just the headlines. Please, Jack or anybody help us with more specifics about how the press might change its behavior so that we don't go through more of this presidency with the president getting away with so many lies so successfully?
Well, I would have thought that the campaign, that the press was under such a burden from the war, that the campaign was going to absolve them, that they were going to be really tough on both sides. But as I say, I think part of the problem is this mandate of fairness. This person says that person says this. Well, it's politics. It's an argument. It's a dispute.
So what replaces it?
I don't know. But I almost think that some way has got to be found to save the public from sort of televisual demagoguery. The public that doesn't pay attention to these things. Some way has got to be found, maybe even in the debates. Before they introduce the candidate, say, here's his position on this subject. Here's his position on that subject. Now let's talk about it. So that the positions are up there. This much budget, this program covered these people. There aren't claims. It's on the board. And you can then debate. Bush can debate market approaches versus government approaches. That's a fair debate. The factual thing is there. The demagoguery is eliminated.
But you know the debates are structured by both candidates very...
Oh, I know.
We have to move on. But I will say that I have a new magazine article in the Neiman Reports coming out suggesting an education campaign for the public to figure out how they can have a consumer movement to determine what kind of news they think is really valuable, as well as a campaign by the press to figure out who they are and what their real job is. Okay, let's move on.
Hi, my name is Clint Richmond. I'm a local historian, and I was struck by the conversation to ask this question. While everyone has opinions, and now anyone can write and publish them, few of us have access. And I think, particularly in contrast to the pre-broadcast media that Mr. Beatty is so familiar with Curly, it's almost become impossible to judge presidents personally. As the population of the country has grown, fewer of us proportionally ever get to meet our senators, much less the president. And yet, so now we seem more reliant on the press than ever, but ironically, that situation seems to have played into the hands of the presidency. We don't have any publishers on the panel, but I'm wondering what we can do to kind of strengthen the power of the press.
How to restrain it?
No.
Strengthen.
Strengthen it.
Strengthen it, sorry.
How about being a blogger?
I think that's pointless.
Really? That's what my students are doing. They're not even paying attention to the New York Times or the Boston
They're uninformed
Globe.
opinions that no one's reading, basically.
But that, I think, has had a huge influence. But I wonder if someone else wanted to take a crack at that.
How do we strengthen the power of the press?
Yeah.
You can't do it unless you're going to have better people in the press. And if this audience in general is depending on the press to hold their feet to the fire, you're leaning on a weak reed. The press just doesn't do that kind of thing, or very rarely. The press is very fine in the textbooks to be the watchdog, but that's something that publishers pay lip service to.
Okay, we have our next questioner.
Yes, my name is William A. Percy, and I'm a colleague of yours at this college. It's gone downhill since I came there in '68, while BC has been going up with good presidents. But this is primarily addressed to Tom Wicker. Are we the
reason it's gone downhill?
Perhaps. The college can't be certified. Tom, the press, like the presidential historians, has consistently ignored the gay United States presidents, which is Buchanan, the only one who never married. Most people think he might have been, as David Donald told me. And one of his students thought Garfield was. But we have a book coming out that Lincoln was primarily a gay president. Last week, the Times, Harvard, and the State Department were denounced, for not doing enough for the Jews at a conference at Boston College. You've practically done nothing for gays, as I pointed out. The gays were persecuted and ignored much later by your institution and the other press, by Harvard and the other universities. And do you intend to get into the question of gay presidents? And do you think that one might have had a gay side?
I'm sorry, one of the penalties of age is your hearing goes what?
Were any of the presidents engaged in any homosexual activity, and is the Times interested in that? We have a book coming out on Lincoln by Tripp, Kinsey's best friend.
Well, the Times just got, and other papers just got through the governor of New Jersey. I would think that if evidence as clear as Mr. McGreevy's own statement came up. I think the Times would pay considerable attention to that. I don't think homosexuality...
Too late for Lincoln to confess, Tom. We have to go with what's in the record.
Okay.
I can just say that, well, we have a Lincoln scholar who's going to come up later on today, but David Donald and other people have looked at the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Speed. It's been well known. People, including my husband, have written about it. Most people don't think that it was a homosexual relationship, but that it was deeply intimate, soulful, close, and loving. So I know that Jonathan Katz and some gay historians claim Abraham Lincoln as a gay president, but I just don't see the evidence is there. James Buchanan is another matter, and I don't think anybody's ever made a strong case for that. It's possible.
More to come on these issues, probably. Thank you. Yes, please. Tell us who you are.
My name is Leah Vetter. I've been listening to this conversation, and the word adversarial has been used repeatedly. But what I hear you talking about is not a lack of an adversarial relationship between the press and the centers of power, not merely the president, but the other holders of power, but a failure of commitment to investigate. And those strike me as two different things. Politically identified newspapers exist all over the world. There are 20 newspapers in France. When I read one, I know what the politics of that paper are. It's not something that's been historically the case in this country. For the most part, the political relationship of associations of the paper are hidden under cover that our papers don't do that they're fair and even-handed. So I'm not opposed to adversaries, if that's clear.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. If we really had investigative reporters doing that job well, and there have been a few in our history, names to which you could point, do you think today that they would have any real influence on the public? I mean, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and the Atlantic Monthly and so on have a lot to do with the way I think about things, but I am not so sure that they have a lot to do with the way at least 48% of the voting public thinks about things.
Thank you. Jack?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, the Maryland poll, the University of Maryland did this big poll, I think of 6,000 people, self-identified Republicans, before the campaign, and they basically found out that over 50% of them believed that George Bush had signed was behind the Kyoto protocols. Something like 60% of them believed that he had signed the land treaty banning landmines. Over 55% believed that either weapons of mass destruction were found or they were about to be made. And similarly on the connection to al-Qaeda. In other words, these were a poll of Republican voters. So the year and more of reporting, rebutting all this stuff, just went out the window. It was like a faith-based electorate. No, we don't believe that stuff. That's the press. That's the media. We believe Mr. Bush.
Okay, we have time for only one more quick question, and I'm sorry, you were the last that I saw, so please go ahead.
My name's Nigel Hamilton. I'm at the McCormack Graduate School at UMass Boston. I'm writing the second volume of my Bill Clinton biography, and I was interested in what Ellen said about how Europeans see the American scene and how far too much attention is paid to the private life of the president. Having lived here for some years as an outside observer, I don't think that will ever change. I think there are just different parameters operating here, and I feel very fatalistic about it. I think the tragedy of Bill Clinton was that in 1994, when he lost the midterm election, he, before really anybody else, recognized that he must take that central position and claim a kind of moral authority as President of the United States. It wasn't just to do with boxer shorts. I mean, he went out and proselytized about family values and in an extraordinary way. And the tragedy was he was saying, well, let's put the past behind us and let's not talk about Democrats and Republicans. Let's talk about what needs to be done in this country, and we're going to marry the political necessities with a better kind of fabric for society and moral values and so forth. And yet, that year, 1995, after the midterm meltdown, was the very year that he struck up his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. And I don't know that America can ever go back on that. I think that's a condition in this country with expectations that people have of this very symbolic position of the president. And if the president just can't hack it, so to speak, then inevitably it's no good just saying, well, we're all human. I mean, he is held to a higher standard, and that was Bill Clinton's tragedy. So.
Well, I want to thank you as a historian for closing our part of the conference. We don't have time to go back to the panel, I'm afraid. But I will say thank you so much. This has been a good launch, and let's keep the conversation going privately. Thank you so much.